Why are we here? Why are we here? And I don't mean that in this kind of esoteric, cosmic, existential question. I mean it firmly in the sense of physical matter reality and events that are taking place on the ground right now in Ukraine. Why are we here? Yesterday, Zelensky basically was in Congress giving a speech. Biden gave the speech after it, basically, yeah, I'm giving more aid. Zelensky was asked for a no-fly zone, which is just astonishing, and is trying to get the world into a larger conflict as opposed to Ukraine being there by itself. On some level, Zelensky, who initially I thought was a patsy, but as this kind of went on, you've heard me say over and over again, is this a situation where this is a win for various geopolitical actors who basically wants to get Russia bogged down into a conflict? Is it a win for those people? Or is it an absolute outright disaster in regards to Western policy? And I'm leaning more on the side towards the people who are saying, yes, we're able to wage this economic war against Russia. We're able to castigate it from the standpoint of a propagandistic war. We're able to drop the context that NATO was expanding to their borders and that we fomented a coup in 2014 that basically eliminated the elected government and put in a patsy coup government that was entirely subservient to the United States, a country that is completely hostile to Russia's interests on their border. We can drop context so we don't necessarily have to deal with all that. But the question still remains, is it a failure or is it a success? And even if it's a success on some level, we're still taking the hit for that success. So you have Germany with their GDP like cut in half or something. In the United States, you have gas prices going through the roof. At the very least, they were yesterday or this week. Food prices are going to go through the roof. The shortages that have been taking place from the standpoint of the supply chains will go through the roof. None of this was an act of God. All of it were issues of policy and policies where they believe West had an advantage, and they wanted to press that advantage over a Russia that had basically collapsed after the Soviet Union fell. They were given assurances. Those assurances weren't lived up to. So if we're going to talk about this issue, at the very least, let's start there. I keep asking, like I say, is this a failure of Western policy or is it a success? The West entirely and fully understood that Ukraine was a red line. They got it all the way back 20 or so years ago. They got it. We will not move 1 inch to the east. And that statement was given because of the problems and concerns associated with this idea of a hostile military organization moving to the borders of the country. And so when I ask, was this planned or not, I think that's somewhat of a legitimate question. In Afghanistan, with the Mujahideen, for example, dragging Russia into a conflict that Russia didn't necessarily want to be in, giving them their Vietnam, a black eye, with the U.S. supplying weapons and whatnot to the Mujahideen. Let's forget for the moment that they eventually became Al-Qaeda. But up to that point, that was considered a policy success. Well, what about this? William Burns wrote, even back in 2008, Russia feels encircled. There are ethnic tensions in Ukraine between people who want to be closer to Europe versus people who want to be closer to Russia. And if we are screwing with that, that can land that country into a civil war in which Russia would have to get involved, not necessarily wanting to. Which gets to my point. If they understood the dynamics of the events on the ground, they understood that those fault lines, no pun intended, exist within the context of Ukraine. And yet they continuously push. You had American politicians showing up at the rallies, cheering them on, these violent mobs being cheered on. The money that we were dropping in using NGOs to train violent protesters in overthrow tactics, to give weapons, munitions, etc., to train mercenaries even. We were basically backing that coup. And when Viktor Yanukovych was basically taken out of office, well, at that point you had a far right-wing coup government that basically was going to take power and run the country. The People's Republic, Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk, leaves. They voted to leave. So did Crimea. They're ethnic Russians, and they realize a far-right Nazi, at the very least, influenced, and definitely Nazis integrated into the military. And they were like, yeah, screw that. They voted to leave. Now, from a standpoint of Western policy, if your goal is to screw over Russia, congratulations. You put them in a Hobbs choice. And in the context of that Hobbes choice, where there was no good answers, either be encircled or get involved militarily, Russia chose security concerns. Would the West be willing to use Ukraine as a patsy in order to accomplish that objective? And my point would be, of course they would. Not just of course they would. The lives of the Ukrainians basically matter less than the accomplishment of foreign policy objectives. And my thought, and that's why I always said Zelensky is no hero. At the end of the day, I consider the guy somewhat of a dirtbag. He basically dragged his country into a war using assurances from NATO as his bolstering agent to believe that, I don't have to implement the Minsk Accords. I don't have to do any of that stuff. I could just be closely aligned to the West and I will be okay. More to the point, was Zelensky in on it? Meaning, did Zelensky know what line he was basically crossing and that the West, I don't think he knew the West was going to leave him in a lurch, but did he fully understand what he was doing or what he wasn't doing meant? You must understand. I understand they say, there are no Nazis in Ukraine. Look, let's dispel that right now. This guy, this is one of the groups that are in Ukraine, C-14. Here's the speech.
Не тому, що ми хороші, як нам кажуть, нам допомагає Захід, бо вони хочуть нам блага, тому що ми виконуємо задачі Заходу. Тому що ми єдині, хто готові їх виконувати, бо нам весело, нам прикольно убивати і прикольно воювати. І вони думають, давайте вже подивимося, що це буде. Тому виник цей новий альянс.
These guys are basically a literal terrorist organization. They call C-14. This is basically one of the leaders of the group. Ukraine is being armed as pawns of the West because we have fun killing. We've started a war. We've started the most javelins in the European continent. We have the European family has already collapsed. Maidan would have been a gay parade if not for Nazi influence. This is him basically owning up and saying the quiet part out loud. C-14 is a terrorist organization. It's a Nazi organization. Don't believe me? What about Bellingcat? Bellingcat is basically an intel cutout. Yes, it's still okay to call Ukraine the C-14 neo-Nazis. Even they are saying it. Right here. Here's another one. The guy who started it, Svoboda, is sitting here shaking hands with one Joe Biden. Joe Biden lovingly looking into the eye of a Nazi, thanking him for his hard work at getting a lot of people killed in a violent coup in 2014. Even The Intercept have hit these stories. I can go through a list of articles that basically attest to this point about Nazis in Ukraine. The Azov Battalion, which functions as an armed wing of the broader Ukrainian white nationalist Azov movement, began with a volunteer anti-Russian militia before formally joining the Ukrainian National Guard in 2014. The regiment is known for its hardcore right-wing ultranationalism and its neo-Nazi ideology pervasive among its members. Though it has in recent years downplayed its neo-Nazi sympathies, the group affinities are not subtle. Azov soldiers march and train wearing uniforms bearing icons of the Third Reich. Its leadership has reportedly courted American alt-right and neo-Nazi elements. And in 2010, the battalion's first commander and a former Ukrainian parliamentarian, Andriy Beletsky, stated that Ukraine's national purpose was to lead the white race of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Übermenschen. Übermenschen. And of course, that's the German word for subhuman, to put it that much finer of a point on it. I don't care if Zelensky is Jewish. That has nothing to do with the point of whether or not you have Nazis that are in your government and if those people are basically integrated into the military and even have sympathizers or outright people part of the political parties themselves in government. It holds sway. Zelensky is almost captured in this situation. You have the poor picture of Zelensky begging neo-Nazis to come, fall in line, and they're basically laughing. Him saying, "I'm not a loser." Kind of are, bro. Kind of are. There are Nazis in Ukraine. That's the point that I'm trying to make. I can go through a list of articles attesting to it. Even going back to Viktor Yushchenko. Viktor Yushchenko ends up taking power in an orange revolution. Basically a coup, because they weren't necessarily happy with the fact that the guy who actually won was Russian, around the Russian orbit. Yushchenko gets in office, fails miserably, and just before he leaves, puts in Stefan Bandera as hero of Ukraine. Stefan Bandera was a violent, bloodthirsty Nazi that killed Russian, Poles, and of course, Jews. That's the guy who they were giving the hero of Ukraine to. The next president that basically took power, it took 4 months for him to remove that particular icon. The point that I'm making is they are lying to you when they are saying there are no Nazis in Ukraine. It is as obvious as the face on your nose. I can show you flag burning ceremonies and everything else. The other part to this has to do with the fact that these guys are fanatical, or fanatics, especially in this notion of hating Russians. That's an important point. You put a fanatical right-wing government that hates Russians on the border of Russia and arming it to the teeth. Arming it to the teeth. Is Zelensky an idiot? And certainly, or does he, had to know that this was a provocation. And in knowing it was a provocation, still continued to go headlong into it. Did Zelensky know that the war was going to happen? Did they intentionally provoke Russia to come into the country believing that they would be able to beat Russia in a conflict, considering they were being armed to the teeth with NATO, all the weapons being poured in from the West, the training and everything else that they've basically been getting from the West? My assessment, based on this gentleman who's about to speak, is apparently yes. Apparently, they looked at this in a sober, dispassionate way, and they thought, in order to be part of the NATO orbit, we will have to go through Russia to do it, because Russia is not going to allow us to do that and undermine their security concerns. This is Zelensky's advisor. This clip is mind-blowing. This clip took place back in 2019. And the stuff that he's saying on this clip ends up being dead on correct, which makes it so spooky. It's also pretty cynical. I mean, you're basically dragging innocent men and women and children into a war for your own geopolitical interests. That geopolitical interest being in alignment with the West. You're not doing it because you need to do it. You're doing it entirely for ideological reasons. And you're going to get a huge number of people killed as you go about those ideological reasons. That war is basically taking place right now because of the malfeasance of the West working with one Zelensky. Let's play the clip. Let's take a look at it. This gentleman's name is Oleksiy Estrovich. He's basically head of the office of the president of the Ukraine. He's an advisor. Listen to what he says.
То есть, если Украина получает выдачи в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно
брали. То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно. Нет, не НАТО. Мы не они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весу, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое?
Of course, a large-scale war with Russia and joining NATO as a result of the defeat of Russia is the coolest thing. In his mind, going through Russia was necessary in order to be part of NATO. Think about how cynical that is. He's basically saying, yeah, our price for joining NATO is a big war with Russia. And making the point of saying, yeah, that's worth it. We're going to win that war. It's going to be the coolest thing. Your cities are surrounded. Your city, your country is being carved up. The various people who you're basically killing now has the backing of Russia, who is, again, on some level ascendant. And all of this, on some level, you guys not just understood what was going to take place, pushed and provoked it. And you are reaping the consequences, not just you, those people that are out there dying as a result of what you were willing to do for your geopolitical objectives. The military is going to be smashed. The Nazis are going to be killed. And ultimately, the regions that want to break away will be carved up. The government of Kiev at this point, no idea what may happen to it. Russia seems to not necessarily want the government to collapse. They want somebody to negotiate with. But ultimately, the longer this war drags on, the worse the terms will be. My point here is that context matters. And when it looks as if the world powers understood a situation was going to develop and allowed it to develop anyway, and not just egged it on, and you have the people in the country that was basically willing to do it and go along with it, and this guy who's an advisor is saying the quiet part out loud, the story you're getting on this, from the standpoint of media, is warped, and it's just radically incorrect. I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on Fault Lines in less than an hour.